Hello, guys. Welcome to Dare to Leave podcast with Mary Ajagbe. I have an amazing guest with me today. Her name is Brittany Braswell. Brittany Braswell, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're talking from?
Yes, Mary, thank you so much for having me on the podcast today. So my name is Brittany Braswell. I am a registered dietitian and eating disorder recovery coach, and
Wow.
I am currently living in the south part of the U.S. in Alabama.
Wow.
So a little bit far away from where you are, but yeah, I love it.
Awesome. So good to have you on board Dare to Leave podcast.
Thank you so
much for honoring the invitation. I am so stoked to have you on here. Okay, so let's just get right into the conversation. So what is fear? What is fear to you? Because I know that we kind of have, a mindset about fear, but I'd really like us to demystify, what fear is really from your perspective, from the coaching perspective, from kingdom perspective. I just really like you to delve into, what fear is.
Yeah. So, I think there's really two sides of the coin when it comes to fear. So fear is an emotion that we experience. And I think oftentimes it's seen as this like really negative thing, right? Because most of the time when we're afraid, it's not like all these butterflies and loosey-goosey, like, oh, I feel great, right? So we tend to think of it as a negative thing. But the Lord created it. Like, we were created with the ability and capacity to fear, and fear can serve a purpose, right? But Scripture gives us a distinct, like, there's a big distinguishing factor. Okay, so I'll speak to just the emotion part of things first. Is that if you have ever heard of or seen the little movie about all of the emotions, it's called Inside Out. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that movie, but it's about this little girl named Riley, and it's a movie about all of her emotions. She's like maybe 10 or something. Wow. And so there's this little character represents the emotion of fear. And he's, seems all neurotic, and he's all over the place, and he's like, oh my goodness, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. And so he serves a purpose of keeping her safe, right? Like in certain under certain circumstances, right? So like, it's good to have a healthy fear. Like for me, I think I have a pretty healthy fear of snakes. Right? Wow. like we had a snake in our backyard a couple of months ago when my husband was cleaning out the gutters, and it was up there, and he found it, right? I need to have a healthy fear of that, because it would not be very beneficial or safe for me to be like, oh, I think I'll just go play with this wild snake, right? So it can serve a purpose. However, Scripture tells us very specifically not to live under a spirit of fear. Right? So in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, it says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Right? And so that spirit of fear is really when your thoughts are consumed and controlled by fear. Like, we're allowing fear to dictate our decision-making process and control maybe how we live out our life. It's more of like a tormenting spirit, right? Feeling the emotion of fear might last a moment, or it might last several moments, right? Like if you're in the middle of a literal storm and thunder or lightning scares you, that might last for a little while, but it's not chronic and persistent, right? It serves a purpose to go, I think I won't run outside with an umbrella right now, or a piece of metal, right? Like it serves a purpose. It's okay to be afraid, but you can't live under constant fear. That's really where you start experiencing a lot of anxiety, and it really can oftentimes create this almost gap or wall between feeling like you're able to connect with the Lord.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. Wow. I love the fact that, you were able to talk about fear as an emotion and fear as a spirit, because I remember there was a time I just, had this same revelational insight that you just gave now. And I just woke up one morning and I just started writing about it, fear as an emotion. And I did a little research on it. Fear as an emotion helps to keep you safe, under certain circumstances. And then fear as a spirit Now, this is where it spirals out of control, out of your control, where you begin to get consumed by a thing, supposedly a spirit that now begins to influence your decision making. And, I really like us to stay there, to really be able to stay in that place where we talk about fear as an emotion, and fear as a spirit. So I'd just like you to share a little bit more on the distinguishing factors between both.
Yeah. So kind of again with feeling that emotion of fear. If I like to distinguish between an emotion and a feeling. I think this helps to sort of break it down a little bit. Okay. Because usually, like, if you think about, and I hear this so often, because I primarily coach women. I have a few men that I work with, but I primarily coach women, and they'll just say, oh, I just get really emotional about this. Or someone says that I'm too emotional. And so when you think about emotion, it's like that outward expression, right? Like it could be tears, it could be laughter. Like those are the things that you're expressing, right? And then the feeling is like your perception of and how you're interpreting that, like how, like, it's the thing that makes you cry or the thing that makes you laugh that you feel, right? Like you might feel love and that might result in a smile or a laughter or a hug, right? And this is a simplified version, but for the sake of trying to distinguish and make this easier to understand, when you can differentiate and go, okay, well, fear is really, it's a feeling, but you also express fear in different ways. So something that could be helpful is to go, okay, well, what does it look like for me to express fear? And so maybe that is, you hear like the physiological response to fear is often that fight, flight, or freeze, right? So when you feel fear, you might get that sort of adrenaline rush, and it might create more of the conflict, right? Some kind of like you're fighting your circumstance, or you're afraid of the conversation you're having with another person and what it means, and it kind of creates some argument, right? So that might be the fight side of things. The flight, obviously, that would be, like you're leaving the situation, you're getting away, might even mean like some isolation, right? Like, I mean, I'll raise my hand to say sometimes when I've been afraid, especially when it involves another person, whether it's physical safety or emotional safety that I'm afraid I don't have, it's easy to isolate and to withdraw, right? And that's where it can turn into the spirit of fear, because if you feel like, God, this should be in my control, he's the one that's actually in control. So when that's a pretty good kind of red flag is when you go, okay, I feel like everything needs to be in my control. You've kind of taken that back from God. You might be moving into that spirit of fear. And then you have the freeze mode too, right? Fight, flight, or freeze, if I can get my words together. And that's like, that happens so often when we feel fears. We just kind of freeze and we don't know what to do. Yes, it's like this paralyzing thing. And it might be physically freezing, or it might just be emotionally, mentally just kind of like numbing out, going, I don't want to feel this. I'm going to push it down. That can also get really dangerous. And it's often a place too where you start backing away, maybe creating some of that wall between you and the Lord, because you feel like maybe something's not changing. I shouldn't be experiencing this anymore. And it can also result in a lot of lack of trust.
Wow. This is making sense to me on so many levels, because I'm just like, wow. Okay, awesome. So let me just ask, so has there ever been a time in your life, I mean, I don't want to assume, so I know that we all experience fear. I've experienced fear and probably might still experience fear on different levels. But I'd just like to know, have you ever experienced fear? What was it like for you? What was, the emotion or the feeling like for you?
Yeah, I would say, honestly, like one of my most vulnerable moments of fear that I kept a secret for a long time, except for my husband, was having this fear that like I might not ever get to be a mom. And so, like, spoiler alert, I am. Okay, so I'll give you the background. I like to start with this because I always want to make sure that like people know there's hope on the other side. Like there's hope that you can get through the fear, right? So fear doesn't have to be this like all-consuming thing that you just sustain forever, this chronic thing. But I thought for a long time I was not going to be a mom, because when my husband and I finally decided, I guess after a little over 3 years of marriage, we were like, okay, I think we're ready to really want to start a family. And nothing happened. I mean, it was months and months. It was about a year or so before we actually found out that we were expecting. And it was this whole journey of in a year. I know for some people who are experiencing infertility or who have, their journey is longer than that. But regardless of the length of it, you're still going to experience those levels of fear as you go through. And for me, I think the Lord really got a hold of me in this, because I was so much in that freeze mode. And some of the flight too, I would say. I was not angry with the Lord about it. I was like, God, I know you are in control of this, but like, why isn't this happening? And so what sort of sparked a different type of fear within that for me is when God said, you need to tell somebody about this. You need to stop only confiding in me, because I already know what's going on. You need to tell someone.
Wow.
And I stiff-armed God, and I was like, no, that is scary. Because in my mind, I had built up that, hey, if I tell someone that, hey, we're kind of struggling with some infertility, we're really wanting to have a child and it's not happening, I was like, that's going to open, the floodgates of emotion. I'm not going to be able to contain myself. Right. So that was one fear. Another fear was, what if I have to talk about it a lot more now? Because it was so painful and so uncomfortable to talk about, that I was like, if I tell someone, they're going to want to check in on me and ask me how I'm doing. And it's going to bring up this same fear and this same like really difficult conversation every time. And I kept stiff-arming God. And so one night at a small group, he was like, you just need to tell people. And this was the first night. We were in a brand new small group, and our first night, I was like, these women are going to think I'm crazy. Like, if I just like pour my story out on this first night, because that's not typical for me. I usually like to spend some time getting to know people before I like, open up the secrets kind of thing. Right. And so that first night, the Lord was like, do it, like ultimatum, like do it now. So I was like, okay, like I can, like, it was this weight that I was like, this only comes from the Lord. This isn't a burdening kind of weight, but it's like, I have to move. Like I can't be frozen anymore. And so I shared with the ladies in my small group that night when we split into prayer time. And I'll tell you, Mary, I never, like, the fear that I thought was going to come out was only peace after I said it. Wow. When I said, hey, I'm having this struggle, they all prayed over me. They like got in a circle around me, laid hands on me, prayed for me, like genuinely just us, like came into agreement with me that this is something that the Lord has promised for us. And it was 9 weeks after that we got to bring our sonogram to small group. Wow. And our OB dated our like gestational age of our son back to that night, which is totally a miracle, because biologically that shouldn't have been correct. And so it was, our son is our miracle baby. He's 4 now, 4.5 almost. And that was my biggest lesson, I feel like, personal journey. And I won't say like I never experienced fear, right? But that was me coming out of that spirit of fear that I was just letting the fear keep me from really, absolutely control me, like keep me from walking in the path that the Lord had for me and being obedient to his calling, right? And so when we let fear be the one making our decisions, that means we're not letting the Lord be the one that's directing our steps. And that's, I think that idea scares me more than anything else, to say, I'm going to try to put myself in control, because I do not need to be in control. I am more scared of trying to be the one in control and God not be than anything else now.
Wow. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing that. Like, when you were talking about the fact that the same night you talked about it on the group was the same night that, it seemed like, your son was conceived. I had goosebumps all over me, like from my head to my toe. I literally was just like, I was shaking, like, okay, wow, that was powerful. That right there was powerful, and Guys, I sure hope that, somebody's listening to this and saying just what being out of that place and learning to, leave yourself to God, what it will do to you, and the miracles that are just waiting to happen in your life. You know, I'm trying to get my thoughts together, because it felt like we're just speaking to my heart, you know, about, how this same spirit of fear would stop you really from fully doing what the Lord would have you do, and also to, leads to a little bit of, not a little bit, but lack of trust, and man, that is awesome, and also was powerful. A lot of times I think that, so I'm gonna say this because I think that I'll have another podcast, session where we'll talk about this. I'd like to have you on, where I feel like we have an unspoken war between therapists, the therapist, coaching, community, and the church. Because I feel like, I don't know if anybody else has experienced that, but I kind of just sense that there's this unspoken war, where people think that, same as how people also feel like, there are certain things when they don't go to see a doctor, when there's an issue and then they leave it. I mean, there's faith, and also, just zoning in on the fact that God gave you an instruction to talk about it. That alone is powerful. Like, I'm aware, I know this is happening to you. It's okay. I'm God. I'll deal with it. But you know what? Talk about it. And I it's so, that alone is freedom. That alone is release. Having the go ahead to be able to talk about some of your inner struggles, it releases the power and the hold that it has over you. And also it helps you to be able to acknowledge that there's a bigger authority, and God is in charge here, and if is created an environment for me to be able to be free of this thing that wants to control me and not want to allow me be the best that God wants me to be, then you know what, we're going to talk about it, and we're going to deal, and we're going to be free. I think that freedom happened for you the moment that you just obeyed.
That's yes, I absolutely feel that too, because I think something that the enemy tries so hard to keep us, like an area where he tries to keep us stuck, is to make us feel like we're alone in the process. And I'll tell you too, that same night, Mary, 2 other women in that group said they were struggling and wanting to be a mom.
Wow.
And they were like, I wouldn't have said anything if nobody else had said it, right? Because they didn't want to talk about it either. And so sometimes your faithfulness or obedience to the Lord opens doors for you to connect with others and for other people to connect with you. And then in James chapter 5, I think it's verse 16, it says, confess your sins one to another and pray for one another that you will be healed. And even though infertility was not a sin, right? It was still, I still had that concept of like, okay, God, like, yes, you're the one that provides me forgiveness. You're the one that's ultimately in control. And at the same time, you want me to be in this setting where I can experience healing from fear. Like, because I wasn't asking God to take the fear so much away. I don't think I even realized how much it was there. But he used that opportunity to make me, right? To like heavily press me to confess this struggle or this fear to other people. And that is really where I experienced the healing, by following through with the obedience and getting it out of, like, it makes me think of that song, like, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
Yes.
There's that verse, like, hide it under a bushel. No, I'm gonna let it shine. And it makes me think of that. And maybe that's partly because I'm a mom of like little ones now, but it makes me think of that, because anytime we keep the things that we're most afraid and most ashamed of in the dark. But once you bring them to light, like, that's where you actually have, you got to expose them before, because the enemy had no power over that fear once I shared it, right? Like, once it was out in the open, I had other people that could pour into me saying like, we're going to walk through scriptural truth. We're going to pray. Somebody prayed, a specific verse over me. And I want to say it's Mark 24:11. Let me make sure I'm telling you this right. This has been one of my most favorite verses. Someone spoke it over me that night. And it says, therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours.
Wow.
And one of the ladies in the group that night said, the Lord has given me this verse for you. He already promised you this child. You just have to come into agreement with them and like stop agreeing with the fear, stop agreeing with the lie of the enemy, and start trusting that this has been promised. And I think that is like, that's such a huge turning point when you're trying to overcome fear, is to stop coming into agreement with the lies of the enemy telling you that you have to stay there, and know that like that's not what you were created for.
Wow. I mean, when you were talking, I just had like, a brief moment up in my head all by myself, talking about fear will keep you away from the promises that God has for you. And fear will keep you away from receiving the promises, that God has made to you. Fear will keep you stuck, and from seeing the light. Fear will keep you in a place that is not so pretty and has a lot of tormenting things to it, just basically just making you feel like, oh no, it's just only you in the whole wide world who's feeling all of this emotion, who's feeling all of this, thing, and you're the only one with the problem. Nobody else is going through it, But the moment you speak out and own up to that, there's healing, there's repentance, there's so much embedded, and most importantly, the promise that God has for you can then fully be delivered into your hands. And I think that Bible passage, which is one of my recent favorite actually, because I did a blog post on it, we're talking about prayer and what God's view about it, is, and that God really just wants you to have what He wants for you, and God says yes to your requests, whatsoever it is that you believe, just talk to Him about it and just believe it. That's the next level, believing that you've received it, and so the first thing was that you desired in your heart, for a child, though it was caged by fear, I just wanted to keep you in that place. But what was the promise? The promise is that God wants you to have it, and then the moment that you were able to speak it out, you owned up to it, you left that place an entirely different person, and the promise was delivered, which is just so amazing. Like, wow, that is a huge testimony right there. Guys, I sure hope you're listening to this, because that was powerful for me. I don't know about you. I know that I just kept on feeling goosebumps while you were talking, and also the fact that you talked about, light, the fact that once you come out of that place of, of being in the dark, by hiding your fears, your struggles, all of that, and you come out, what happens then is that there's connection to God, on a deeper level. There's trust, increased. There's also healing for other people also too. You get to also connect with other people going through what you're going through, and they also can find healing and also find encouragement and support, knowing that, I'm not alone in this. So there's somebody out there who also feels this, and really, that was just purely amazing. Wow. So I just thank you for sharing, all of that, and for being honest and vulnerable with us on this podcast. Thank you so much. So I'd like us to take it a little bit further. To what do you think? I know that you mentioned some of these things, and I also picked some of this point out, but I'd just like us to for the listeners to be aware. What do you think is waiting on the other side of fear?
Oh man, the biggest thing I would say, and I spoke to it just a tiny bit, but it's really peace. Fear is one of those things, like I said, that can often make you feel really trapped, or you may use the term like keep you in bondage, right? But when you're delivered from fear, and that oftentimes takes you playing an active role in the process, right? Because it's one thing to say, Lord, please like take this fear from me. And at the same time, we've got to be a part of that, right? It's not just a matter of, okay, all of a sudden you're not afraid. It's, okay, let me walk you through this process so that you can see there's not a reason to be afraid. And so I think there's a lot of trust in that. So when you get to the other side of fear, that is really where you have the opportunity to experience peace and freedom.
Wow.
Not just freedom from fear, but I mean, with the ladies that I work with, because I primarily work with women who are really struggling with, maybe they've yo-yo dieted their whole life, or they have a ton of anxiety around food, or their body image and self-worth is so low because of the way that they view themselves and their identity. what I really love getting to see in so many of those clients, when they start getting back, like when they start escaping that fear of food and of that fear of, you know, what do other people think of me because of the way my body looks, or the way that I eat, or whatever it might be. There's so much freedom in now being able to not only hear from the Lord, but to like live in this place of continued sustained peace and be able to make decisions that don't feel pressured by fear, or you don't have that grip on you that keeps you from being able to take action, so that when the Lord calls you to something, it's not this waiting game of, okay, well, what if this, or what if this, or if it doesn't go this way, or, oh, I can't do that because I don't have enough control over that. I think there's so much room, in addition to peace, for growth, because you're going to be able to quickly, I shouldn't say quickly exactly, but like you're going to be able to respond when the Lord calls a lot more easily, because there's going to be so much more trust there. Because when you start seeing, one of the best ways that I've seen to overcome fear is to put your trust in the Lord and give him a chance to prove that there isn't that reason to fear, right? Like the example or analogy most everybody has probably heard, or some version of it, is like, okay, well, if I know you guys can't see me, but like if I'm got this chair that I'm sitting in, I can walk in the room and look at it, and I have faith that it's going to hold me up because I've done it before. I've sat in it before, right? If it's now I assembled it. We ordered it from the store and I assembled it. So the first time I sat in it, I had to have trust that it was going to hold me up, right? Because it was not a lived experience. I had to trust that I followed the instructions and the people, and that it was going to do what it's supposed to do. So there's a distinguishing factor there too, and like trust and faith, right? So, and it can kind of go, you know, I probably said that backwards. You have to have faith is like the belief in something that you haven't seen or experienced yet. So I apologize, I flipped those words, but like I had to have faith that it was going to hold me up. And then trust is when you put your faith in action, right? So I had to sit down and actually trust that it was going to do what it needed to do. And the same thing happens. That's what it takes, I think, a lot of times to overcome fear, is to say, okay, because I hear this all the time, Lord, I have faith that this is possible, or I have faith in the Lord that he can do this. But then the kicker question is like, okay, well, how have you trusted him with that? You say you have faith for it, but have you trusted him with it? And a story that someone shared with me on this a while back that I feel like is so powerful, and I'd have to go back to give you the exact name because I can't remember the guy's name, but there was this tightrope walker. I think it was back in the 40s, 60s, I forget. And he was really famous for all these kind of amazing, like high wire kind of activities and tricks. And so he did this huge act from, I think it was across like the Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls. It was Niagara Falls. And he did this big show. He walked across, like it's this huge, expansive, you know, cable that he's walking across, walks forwards, walks backward, does all these different tricks. And then he takes a wheelbarrow across, and it's like filled with, I think it was rocks or maybe like potato sacks or something heavy, right? And he's like, okay, who believes I can do this? Who has faith that I can get across this? And they're all like, yes, you know, you can do it. So he goes across, comes back, and, you know, everyone's going crazy cheering. And then he says, now who believes I can take a person across? Who has faith that I can take somebody in this wheelbarrow across? And so they're all like, oh my goodness, he's about to do this like crazy stunt with a volunteer. So then he says, okay, he doesn't have somebody on his team to do this. He says, now who will be the volunteer? Right? Like, who is going to put trust? You've all just seen me prove that I can go back and forth, take this heavy load right here. Who's going to get in the wheelbarrow? And of course, nobody raised their hand, right? Nobody's like, I'm not going to do that. Like, so then at that point, it really becomes this heart check of, okay, do I say I have faith, or do I actually have faith? Because when you do have faith, that's where the trust follows through. So if you're struggling in that place of overcoming fear, going, okay, I have faith that it's possible, but I'm too scared to actually put my trust in the Lord. That's a really good heart check place. And that's a really good place to be. Maybe that's your little kicker to say, okay, I do need to reach out and tell somebody about this, because maybe I'm going to get some of that healing talking to someone that will really help me to more actively put my trust in the Lord to overcome this fear.
Wow. Wow. That is awesome. That is so awesome. Thank you, Brittany. When you were talking a few seconds back about that part, the story that you told about the guy who I just walked back and forth, I just had like, this thing in my head where it kind of just felt like, I could hear, it's almost like a relationship with God sometimes, and how it is like how God has proven, through, through the Bible about so many things that, He's done for His children and things that He can still do and will do for His children. Maybe even spoken to you in your life about personal issues, and said, what, will you trust me in this area? And I'm going to just, do this. And it reminds you about things that is done. So there's a song I like by Maverick City Music where a line in the song that talks